Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. You can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. This episode is going to be very specialized for the academic audience, and in particular, those of you working in computational social science. And the topic we'll be discussing today is digital behavioral data, and in particular, web browsing data, which is essentially a data type that captures individual users' browsing histories across the internet. So if you think about your own browsing history, what you have is essentially a list of URLs or links from Google Chrome, Firefox, whatever. And they're kind of a mess, right? They give you an indication of where you've been, but there's a lot of those links. And so essentially, web browsing data is this list of links. And the question is, how can we use that to understand and answer social science questions, but also of particular interest for this podcast, what can we learn about social media behavior through these web URLs, which, as we'll discuss in the episode, are not exactly very granular in terms of what people are doing and seeing on social media. And my guest to discuss this is Professor Sebastian Stier. He is the scientific director of the Department Computational Social Science at GISIS, which is the Leibniz Institute for Social Sciences, and he's a professor of computational social science at the University of Mannheim. And Professor Stier is one of the key actors driving this field forward in terms of the scientific questions, but also the methods behind working with web browsing data. And so I'm really excited to have him on the show because in a way, this method helps us get around some of the API limitations and data closures that a lot of us are struggling with, even though I'll note that it seems like TikTok is beginning to approve API access, which I wonder about the timing with their potential upcoming ban. But regardless, I think we do need, as a community, ways to future-proof our research against this type of over-reliance on API data. And web browsing data, along with data donations, seems to be a very positive step in that direction. So Professor Stier has published a number of guides describing this method and comparing differences in data structures across different service providers, but also different country samples. And so in the episode description, you'll find a list of links to those resources that Professor Stier has written with colleagues, as well as two R packages that help with the parsing of this data developed by colleagues at GISIS. We'll also talk about linking web browsing data and survey data, which is a really exciting field of research to fill gaps between both data types. And we'll also talk a little bit about LLMs and the role that they seem to be playing in helping to analyze and interpret this data. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Sebastian Stier. Again, he is the scientific director of the Department of Computational Social Science at GISIS and professor of computational social science at the University of Mannheim. Professor Stier, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So to start out here, much of the research on digital traces has focused on social media metrics, such as collecting posts or reactions from a single platform. But web browsing data is different in that it collects where users are navigating to across the internet more broadly. So could you give us an introduction to what web browsing data actually captures and how this type of data can be useful for social science research?
So before talking about the actual data, I'd first like to talk a little bit about the underlying paradigm and the general idea why collecting such web browsing data makes a lot of sense and how it moves beyond the data that we've been using as a field in the last decade or so. So as many of you know, most of the time we've taken a platform-centric approach in our research. So usually we would grab data from a given platform, let's say Twitter or X, where data was most widely available. And then we would assess to what extent such data would suit our research question and grab data ideally from an API, which gives us nicely structured data. However, most of the time we did or do not have a lot of knowledge about the users that are actually generating the data. So we have a little bit of information, we have their screen names, we might have some self-reports about their location, but generally we do not know about their underlying motivations for posting on a given platform. And for sure, we also do not know about their attitudes, their attributes, their demographics, etc. So with web browsing data, we move from a platform-centric approach to a user-centric approach. So we recruit people from certain sources, let's say a market research panel. We know who these people are. We know about their characteristics. We can survey them about their attitudes. And we can then ask them whether they also want to participate in such collections of their digital behavioral data. And with that approach, we can connect much more easily and logically to micro-level theories of behavior and attitude formation in different fields like psychology, sociology, communication science, or political science. And one additional advantage is the degree of control that you have over many of these research design aspects that are very much unclear when you grab platform data. You know about your sample, and you can also get the informed consent of these people who give you their digital behavioral data. And of course, this approach, this user-centric approach, can be combined with different collections of individual level data. It could be smartphone-based data collections. It could be data donations. So you can ask people to download their data packages from platforms such as Facebook, and then they can upload this to your server. Or you can indeed also collect web browsing data. And web browsing data is collected via browser plugins. So we ask people to install these plugins, and then we get their behavior across different online venues. And of course, web browsing data is really useful if you want to model trajectories of human behavior. How do people get from X to Y? For instance, if people search for news on Google, on which news domains do they actually end up? Do they arrive at Breitbart, some hyperpartisan website, or are they directed to the New York Times if they search for politics on Google?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a super fascinating approach and one that helps us get around some of those issues with the API closures. But can you talk a little bit about how this data is collected practically? You mentioned web browsers, but you've also published a guide that'll be down in the episode description where you mention a number of providers and collection technologies. So what types of technologies are available to assist researchers in collecting web browsing data? And what are some of the key differences between the various solutions on offer?
Essentially, there are three approaches, at least three approaches I can think of when it comes to collecting web browsing data. So the first one is a data donation approach, which was taken in the tool Web Historian, created by Erika Menchen-Trevino at least 10 years ago, where she asked participants to download their web browsing history from Google Chrome, and the tool would grab this history then. So the historical user web browser data from one given browser. So that is the first approach. And the second approach is oftentimes taken in these commercial market research panels where we can get surveys and web tracking data in combination, for instance, at YouGov. And these commercial providers have tools like Wakupa or RealityMine that essentially are also browser plugins that provide you a URL and a timestamp of a website visit. So with the first two approaches, you know that people visited the New York Times, which article they were reading on the New York Times, and you also have a duration of the visit and a timestamp. And then there's the third approach developed by academics who know very well which data they need for their research questions. And this is an approach that does not just take the URLs and timestamps and temporal patterns into account, but also grabs the content of website visits. One example is WebTrack, a tool that was developed by Silke Adam and Michaela Meyer, or newer developments like tools developed by the National Internet Observatory, led by David Lazar in the US, or my own team at GESIS. And we directly scrape the content, the HTML content that was seen by a study participant, which is a major advantage over the existing tools because you immediately see how the website looked at a given point in time when the participant was visiting, for instance, the starting page of the New York Times. That is, of course, changing dynamically. And if you would like to scrape the content of this website visit ex post, a week after the participant visited the website, of course, the content has changed tremendously. And therefore, you do not, with the previous two approaches, you were not able to really get the content exposure, so the stuff that people were actually seeing, which is now possible with this third approach, where we directly grab the content of web visits.
Yeah, and that's super useful because even individual news articles can be kind of updated on a rolling basis. But can you describe a little bit how, I mean, one limitation it seems is that of the first approach especially is that it only grabs from a web browser.
Yes, indeed. So the major limitation and the major gap of these web tracking approaches is that indeed you get the most granular data for desktop computers or laptops, including the most important browsers, Edge, Firefox, and Chrome. Soon there will also be a Safari component, but what you do not get is behavior via smartphones. Here it is really much harder to get the data because Android and iOS are really good, luckily, at protecting their users. And therefore, for academic research, it is really much harder to get the content of what is actually seen on smartphones, especially within apps, because we know that on smartphones, of course, many people also read the news within Facebook or within a certain news app. And getting these data is really the next logical step for this whole research field, because we know that a lot of relevant political content is, of course, consumed via smartphones.
Gotcha, gotcha. And I think many of the listeners might be thinking, at least I'm also thinking when I hear about this method, is like, who on earth would sign up to have their browser data tracked or to hand that over to researchers? And it's a similar problem also with data donations. And you note that response rates for these methods tend to be quite low, and recruiting from online panels or social media could lead to some additional biases. So could you tell us how researchers tend to recruit people to participate in these studies, and what are some of the risks that arise from different recruitment methods?
Yeah, indeed. So systematic dropout is the major challenge to this user-centric approach. Some people are obviously more likely to participate in such studies than others, and this selectivity might then systematically bias your sample. Of course, to what extent such a skew in your sample is a problem also depends on the research question. Sometimes we are just interested in relationship between variables, and it might not be that important to have a representative sample. But generally, you want to have also societal strata that use the internet at least decently represented in your sample. But still, methodologically, data linking is not new at all. We can build on established knowledge. There's, for instance, a really large literature on record linkage in survey methodology that mostly concerned the linkage of surveys with administrative records. So, for instance, labor market histories of respondents. And it's really interesting that the overall consent rates that we achieve in the linkage with digital behavioral data are not that much different from the consent rates in this established literature, even though our data collections are for sure pretty intrusive and are privacy sensitive. So there are no striking differences to these other linkage designs that we already have used in the social sciences. One experiment that we did, for instance, of course, we found that some variables matter. We found that age, gender, and intensity of usage of a given platform matter. So people who were more active on a platform were also more likely to participate in our study, interestingly. And most importantly, actually, are incentives, aka money. So you really need to pay participants in order to get them into your studies. But interestingly, privacy concerns did not dampen participation in our study. But there's really a lot of experimentation going on currently, especially with vignette studies, where people are trying to find out under which conditions and with which incentives, etc., people are willing to participate in such collections of digital behavioral data. And it's really important to understand this selectivity and better estimate the biases in our samples.
Yeah, I've seen this with data download packages, kind of looking at different thresholds of money to when people actually do decide to participate. Do you have an idea roughly of what the kind of incentives look like for people to participate? What type of euro amount are we talking about?
Yeah, interestingly, in these market research panels, people are paid roughly €5 or so per month if they keep being active in such a data collection, which does not seem like a lot. And in our new panel that we are building at GESIS currently, we're also experimenting with different incentive sizes. So this is currently being analyzed, so we do not yet have a working paper. But in general, it's less than you would assume that you would have to pay participants. So yeah, we were varying, I think the incentives were varying between 5 to 40 euros. And the differences were actually not that significant. So these different experimental groups were equally likely to participate in our study, independent of the incentive size, which is really good news for academia in general.
Definitely, especially as budgets are, are tightening
Yes.
in many universities. But let's talk about the actual structure of the data, because what you get is essentially across these different providers a list of URLs, a big list of URLs. And while the structure of these links can be a little bit messy and inconsistent across websites, you note how there can be meaningful information within the URLs themselves. For example, if you have a Google URL, you might be able to get the actual query that the user was searching on Google by extracting it from the URL. So could you describe how a researcher would go about parsing these URLs for information, and what kind of valuable information are inside of those URLs?
Yeah, indeed. The raw data is rather unstructured. And in each and every project, you need to add some data annotations that you really require just for getting started, for sorting and aggregating the data in the first place. And most of the time, you will be looking at the host domain, which is, for instance, newyorktimes.com or google.com. Even if your research question indeed focuses on search queries, where you are just essentially interested in the search terms that are in the URL, you still need to identify Google or Bing first. So the first step is usually that you extract the domain, and then you match the domain with a list of annotations that you have prepared beforehand. And then you can dig deeper. You can extract a subdomain like search.google.com, and you can use all sorts of URL parameters like search strings. And I will spare you the details here, because luckily there are tools for URL manipulation. They exist in Python, and recently a couple of colleagues at GESES, led by David Schoch, also have created 2R packages that help you working with URLs and web tracking data in general. And the names of these two packages are WebTrackR and ADAR, and they help you with all of these required pre-processing steps when you want to work with URLs and web tracking data.
Very nice. Then I was also thinking, and you mentioned this also in your guide, that there tends to be this kind of like long tail distribution where, I mean, if you think about the possible websites that people could visit, it's enormous, right? There's so many things to visit on the internet, but there also tends to be this clustering around certain big websites like Google or Facebook or maybe Amazon for shopping. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about that kind of distribution at the individual level. And if users tend to cluster around major websites, does that make the parsing of this data a little bit easier for researchers?
Yeah, so this skewed distribution is a very typical phenomenon when we work with web data. As in most online venues, the distribution is really skewed. That means that the most visited domain is usually Google, with an almost 100% coverage of participants. But there are hundreds of thousands of domains that only get visited by a couple of persons, right? So there's this very skewed distribution. And on the one hand, it helps the research process, as you indicate, as we do not have to sort all of the material. We do not have to code the full internet, billions of domains probably. But if we are satisfied with just domain level annotations, as I outlined before, we can actually cover something like 80% of all website visits if we only code the top 5,000 or so visited domains. So if you have high quality annotations at the domain level for the most visited domains, you can really sort and aggregate and process and manipulate your data really easily. So the skewed distribution actually helps the research process here. But on the other hand, these skewed variables are also a challenge for statistical analysis. So if we use browsing as a dependent variable, this very skewed distribution, you cannot just use OLS blindly, but we often have to resort to something like negative binomial models or Poisson models that are suited for such skewed count variables with a lot of zeros, especially. And if web browsing acts as an independent variable, you will also have to think about logging the variable, as we often cannot expect linear effects. So in terms of statistical modeling, these skewed variables are a little bit painful.
Yeah, you can't just draw these strict predictive lines a lot of times, but it's super interesting. And then I'm curious about what we can learn about social media behavior, because I think on the one hand, when we're going this kind of classic route of collecting data through APIs, we're typically looking at one platform, and we're also looking at something like a page or a group and looking at the kind of metrics across that group. But because, I mean, I assume that there's some information that you can get by looking at the web browsing data about what people are visiting within a social media platform. So maybe what pages they're visiting. I'm not exactly sure because I haven't worked with this data. So what types of behaviors could a researcher infer about social media use through web browsing data? And, are there issues in how different platforms display these links that makes maybe looking at this individual level a little bit complicated?
Yeah, these large online platforms, or online intermediaries, as we called them in a couple of publications, are of course major players that shape modern digital behavior, and they are used a lot in our data. So they mostly make up the top 10 or top 20 of most visited domains in our web tracking data. And here, the elephant in the room, what can we learn about social media from web tracking data? And so far, traditional web tracking techniques were only able to capture URLs. So if you got lucky, you see the occasional facebook.com Donald Trump link in the URL, but most exposure actually happens within the Facebook feed, which we cannot track with these established web browser tools. But recently, related to what I said before, there's a lot of innovation, especially in academic circles. Some researchers have built specific scrapers that also allow us to capture the content within social media. And we were lucky to do so in 2021 in one study where we were able to capture the public content on Facebook with very specific filters, which you need to have because you need to discard non-public content from Facebook, like private messages, of course, right, which are super privacy sensitive. And amazingly, in this data collection, we were able to turn 100,000 Facebook visits, so a visit that leaves a URL trace, most of the time facebook.com, right? And we were able to turn these 100,000 Facebook visits into approximately 500,000 public Facebook posts that were actually seen on the newsfeed. And of these, approximately 10% even contain some sort of election and news-related content. And that tells us that with these new browser data collection tools that are also able to capture such public content on Facebook, we get really amazing new insights into not just what people are doing on websites, but also what people are doing within social media and how these two relate to each other, which I think is really crucial because people get referred to web content via social media, and then they read articles into more depth and more detail. And with these integrated tools that capture exposure within and outside of social media, I think the field can do really, really interesting research in the next couple of years.
Absolutely. It's super exciting because I think, just to clarify, I mean, in the more traditional forms of web browsing data, you would just get a link if someone explicitly searched something within Facebook or clicked on an actual page, but not the exposure of just scrolling on the feed.
No, not even that. So you would, of course, have, I mean, just you can try it yourself. If you go to Facebook, oftentimes what you do is not resolved in any sort of URL. So you stick to facebook.com. If you browse the newsfeed, obviously, if you click on comments, if you read comments, oftentimes there will be no URL trace. And with these specific filters, we can identify different pieces of content in the Facebook HTML, and then just grab these contents that are public to make sure that we do not get any private communication. But so far, we were only able to get at what is going on within social media platforms if there's some sort of URL trace, which oftentimes, again, doesn't change. So oftentimes you would just have a visit to facebook.com. It can take, 10 minutes or so, but content-wise, you're really left in the dark what people are actually doing there.
Right. Just getting a facebook.com
Yeah.
link. Interesting. So we've been talking a lot about the kind of structure of this web browsing data, but one thing you've been working on extensively is linking this web browsing data to survey data. So could you talk a little bit about the logic here? What are the benefits of linking browsing data with survey data?
So first, of course, the data linking might help us to fill some gaps, as you indicate. I said before that the major limitation is that we cannot track mobile activities. This is something, of course, you can try to get at via surveys. But again, I think it depends on the research question, to what extent such gaps matter. And certainly more research is needed on the exact nature of these coverage gaps. What do we miss if we do not capture television, which we obviously don't, if we do not capture reading newspapers, if we do not capture mobile activity. And of course, for this, we need new data collection techniques also to better estimate what types of activities are done via certain devices. But survey data can also inform about these coverage gaps, and they also help us enrich the behavioral data because there are well-established and well-validated survey scales that help us getting at the demographics, at the attitudes of people. And the major advantage is that the behavioral aspect is captured directly because the most important justification for doing this tracking is that the survey-based self-reports of media exposure just have very limited validity. There were a couple of validation papers published in recent years that show that if you ask people about what they were doing yesterday on social media, the recall is just going to be really bad. And if you combine web tracking, these direct measures of exposure, of behavior, with the well-working survey constructs, you then have a much richer data set that allows you to make these relevant inferences that we want to do in the social sciences.
Absolutely. And so I think that's the, as you mentioned, a sort of key benefit is enriching the survey data by having real world measures of internet behavior. And then you're also enriching the web browsing data by adding some validated survey scales, as you mentioned. But I'm curious, is there another dimension here where maybe the web browsing data can be used to create variables that enrich the survey data, by which I mean maybe you can infer something about what people are interested in through their web browsing behavior and sort of create categorical variables with the survey data based on that. I'm just curious if that approach has been applied.
Yeah, especially in the last few years with the emergence of large language models and a couple of new developments with respect to simulating data. This is a really promising research avenue that we look at web behavior and use web behavior to try to fill some gaps in the survey data. If you think about unit non-response or item non-response, it could be that if we use traditional imputation techniques from the field of survey methodology and add additional variables from the web tracking or other types of behavioral data collections, we might be able to get a fuller picture. We might be able to fill some gaps in the survey data. We might be able to even simulate survey responses, especially with large language models. And here, I think, as usual, data enrichment is just, as you say, works both ways and can be really valuable for answering different types of social science research questions with new and hopefully well-validated data, since we have a lot of information on our respondents.
Yeah, it's a super interesting avenue of research. And on the one hand, it's kind of interesting to me that it's taken so long to use these use the internet data to complement surveys. It seems like such a logical fit. But why don't we look at an example from your research about how to use these methods in practice? And using web browsing and survey data from 6 countries, you've analyzed how social media and search engines affect exposure to news. So can you outline what you found in that research and how web browsing data linked with surveys can help nuance our understanding of modern news consumption?
In this paper that was published in the APSR, we especially exploited the sequential nature of web browsing data. So our main research question was how people arrive at news websites and not just news articles in general. I mean, a lot of stuff on news websites obviously is non-political and democratically not very relevant, but we also wanted to investigate how people arrive at specifically political news articles and what the role of these large online intermediaries is in these processes. And with these online intermediaries, we were focusing on social media, on search engines and portals such as MSN, where people might go to check their emails. And indeed, we found that if such a website like these online intermediaries is visited, the likelihood that you go to a news website afterwards is considerably higher compared with all other types of websites, which is an interesting finding because oftentimes there are these assumptions about filter bubbles, about news avoidance. Platforms such as Facebook would steer people away from public affairs information, that Facebook would guide people to websites that cater to the entertainment preferences, for instance, of people. But we find the opposite, that indeed these intermediaries steer people towards news websites. And thanks to the survey data, we were also able to show that this effect holds across different groups in the population, that, for instance, levels of political interest or education did not mediate this relationship so that this effect was really robust across different groups. And we come to the conclusion that intermediaries at least did not exacerbate any inequalities in news use, which is sometimes a notion that we see in the literature that social network sites would increase these inequalities in access to news.
Definitely. And I'll link to the paper in the episode description so readers can get a fuller picture there. But I want to pick up on this idea of filter bubbles or echo chambers, which, I just, all the students that I teach just come in with this idea that this is a true phenomenon. And I'm wondering from the perspective of data, I mean, thinking about how APIs deliver data, that we have to search for certain keywords or that we only focus on one platform. It seems that the way that the data is delivered and the kind of computational tools that we have seem to kind of, you can find an echo chamber somewhere, almost by the way that the data is collected and processed. And it seems that web browsing data can kind of get around that by looking at the individual level and getting a bigger picture of where they're searching online. And I think your study speaks to that. So I'm curious if you could kind of give our listeners a little bit of insight on what you think about these echo chambers and filter bubbles as it pertains to data collection and maybe how this web browsing data looks at this phenomenon in a different way.
I think a lot of the findings on online polarization, echo chambers, filter bubbles, etc., are really contingent, as you say, on the data collection mode. A classic example is if you want to study polarization on Twitter, you would probably get your sample or filter your sample based on a bunch of keywords like MAGA, Trump, Biden, or whatever. And then you have a sample of highly politically interested users in the US. I don't know, 3 million users who have posted about US politics in the 10 weeks before the 2020 election or something along these lines. And of course, how you construct your sample, of course, affects the findings that you are going to get, because people who post about politics on Twitter, so no, people first who are on Twitter in the first place are, of course, very special in certain respects. These people are probably more interested in politics. These people are probably higher educated, so you already have a certain skew in your sample. And then if these people also post on politics, on these, let's say, rather charged keywords that are really closely related to polarization in the US, the types of patterns that you're going to get, if you draw a network, if you draw a retweet or ad mention network, they are going to resemble these partisan silos, as we often talk about them in the literature. You are, of course, going to identify these different political camps related to the Republicans and the Democrats. And with web browsing data, you can take a bigger picture approach. You can look at what is actually going on across different web venues. So the research of Andy Guess is really illustrative in that respect. He shows that when it comes to news exposure and news consumption, most people still get their news in the middle of the ideological spectrum. Even Republicans, of course, go to Fox News quite a bit, but they also get their news a lot from rather centrist news outlets. And with web browsing data, of course, you can overcome this platform-centric data collection approach that predetermines your findings if you want to study political polarization.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much potential here by looking at this higher level view of internet behavior. So my last question for you here is, where do you see this emerging field going as you're starting to have these really cool innovations with breaking out Facebook.com into more granular patterns of behavior? What are you and your colleagues working on at the moment?
We are primarily trying to build infrastructures. So first, we need to continue developing, maintaining, improving these academic web browser data collection tools. We need to empower the community to also work with these tools and the resulting data, because there are a lot of insights and untapped potential in these data that we, from our political communication perspective, have not yet even thought about. Second, we also need to build some infrastructures across countries, because only by probing the robustness of research designs across different political and cultural contexts, we can actually generate robust empirical evidence if we think about the effects of digital media on democracy, right? Which is the research question our community is mostly interested in currently, I would argue. And then we really need to look at the content of exposure in much more detail. The existing research with web browsing data has mostly stick to the domain level. We categorize something as news, as search, as, let's say, shopping-related behavior. But we also get the HTML content, and especially with these rapid developments in the field of automated text analysis with large language models and stuff like that, there's really great promise to actually measure really sophisticated and demanding social science constructs also from the content that our participants are seeing. And then if we have these validated measures of content exposure, we can link back these measures to attitudes and also changes in attitudes and behaviors. And overall, I really think thanks to their multidimensionality, web browsing data really holds great promise in different disciplines. And we have not yet even started to think about all of the theoretical avenues that you can take with this data type.
Absolutely. It's a super exciting method and field of research. And hopefully the listeners who've stuck around this long may be interested in taking up part of that endeavor. So Professor Stier, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
I've just been speaking with Professor Sebastian Stier. He is Scientific Director of the Department of Computational Social Science at GASIS and Professor of Computational Social Science at the University of Mannheim. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let's see. No plans on the topic of the next episode. It's a bit busy here with the end of the semester, but keep an eye on those feeds. Something will be coming out in the not too distant future. Until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Melma. See you next time.